Thank you very much, Susanna, Oki, and all the organizational committee for taking this so important initiative to share these 2 days together in order to share some moment of our finitudes and also our thought on Jean-Luc Nancy. It's a great pleasure to see many friends online, many friends of Nancy's, and of course, that's quite an emotional moment for me as well. So thank you. So my title once more, The Insurrected Thought, Jean-Luc Nancy. Let me repeat my hypothesis. Jean-Luc Nancy's thought is driven by a latent insurrectional force which manifests when facing the ontological fact of finitude. Paradoxically or not, the most direct way to approach the hypothetic insurrectional dimension of Nancy's philosophy is to confront it with his heretic reformulation of the idea of resurrection. In Noli tangere, this surprising short book from 2003, part of the series of publications which develops the program of the so-called deconstruction of Christianity, the term is of course of Nancy's, perhaps the most surprising and certainly the most radical among them all, book which takes up the central question of Nancy's work of the 90s, especially those around the body and touch, in order to reformulate them in the perspective of the deconstruction of Christianity. Nancy formulates proposals which are far from lacking in daring. I quote, "In a certain way, Christianity will have been the invention of the religion of touch, of sensitivity, of the immediate presence in the body and in the heart." End of quote. Not without surprise, but entirely in the path opened by the project of the construction of Christianity, in Noli tangere, the emphasis on the finite body, insistence on the persistence of the body through the experience of finitude, its infinite persistence, paradoxically goes hand in hand with the image of the raising up of the dead body, which Nancy prefers as the literal translation of the Greek anastasis, resurrection. Another quote, "Onto the horizon of finite life."
지난해 중순부터 1년 동안 매달 평균 4천만 원이나 올랐는데요. 지난 7월에는 이곳 전용.
This is a voice from out there. So I repeat the beginning of my quote. "Onto the horizon of finite life, the horizon is the limit, is superimposed without being opposed an infinite raising up." Raising up is here the translation of the French la levée. End of quote. Perhaps here, I know that we are among Francophones, but still one clarification, because I think it's quite an important one. The term le lever du corps, which Nancy chose in order to translate the Greek anastasis, has a very peculiar meaning in French. And it literally means the transportation of the dead body to the funeral. And maybe here I can share a personal experience, which in a way revealed the radicality of and also the ambiguity of Nancy's proposal. It is a few months ago, August 31, when many of Nancy's friends went to his funeral in Strasbourg. This is one of the things that happened in the morning, la levée du corps de Jean-Luc Nancy. So this is just to emphasize how radical the proposal to translate anastasis by la levée du corps. So in this line, Nancy affirms the following risky connection. I quote, "This stance," the French word is tenue, "is literally the anastasis or resurrection, that is the rising or uprising, in brackets. Insurrection is also a possible meaning of the Greek term," end of quote. neither regeneration, so this was not the end, of course, sorry, neither regeneration nor reanimation, but the uprising, the raising or the lifting as the verticality perpendicular to the horizontality of the tomb. And here is the true end of quote. So taking up the analysis of the figurative concept of anastasis, resurrection, I will try to measure the consequences of the connection between resurrection and insurrection for Nancy's intransigent thought of finitude. Before dealing with the Greek anastasis, let me say a few words on the origin of the words that possibly translate it, resurrection and insurrection. Let me start with the etymology of resurrection, which comes from late Latin resurrectionem, but in the case of insurrection, insurrectionem. Nominative form, it will be insurrectio, which literally means rising up or a new rising up. Noun of action, which is the participle stem of insurgere, insurgere, to rise up, to lift oneself, to rise against, to stand high, etc. Where in the case of insurrection, insurgere, we can hear the particle in also as a merely intensive particle, meaning making it in the sense of to rise. So surgere, surgere itself means to rise, arise, get up. And it is obviously a contraction of surrigere, subregere, which literally would say to rise from below, which literally gives the common nowadays insurrection or uprising. So, as we know, as to the Greek word anastasis, it also comes, we hear the root stasis. It results from the verb hystenai, hystemi, to place, to hold, but also to stand up. Stasis, therefore, means not only to be still, but also to remain in place, in a way to insist, from where comes the specific Greek meaning of stasis, civil war, which was the obsession of Greek polis, as we all know, and which haunted Greek authors for decades, 4 centuries. So in opposition to the established conception of stasis, in her seminal book, The Divided City, Nicole Leroux proposed a complex, intense, and dynamic reading of stasis, in a way synonymous of kinesis, movement, or, I quote, more exactly, agitation. But for the philosophers who are concerned with the determinations of being, there is also the evidence of stasis as the name of immutable being, of the standing position of immobility. And in fact, hystemi means also to place or to stop, end of quote. Straight in the line of this polemical Heraclitean interpretation of the stasis, Nancy in his turn ventures to read anastasis, the resurrection, as insurrection, as an uprising. Thus he faces the ontological question as such. Being could be only approached in its intensity or in its transformative rupture beyond the opposition between immobility and panmobility, between, so to say, figuratively, Parmenidean and Heraclitean tradition. In Nancy's thought on resurrection, a new answer, in potentia at least, to this millenary division and debate could take place. And is his answer on what is neither nor, of what displaces the idea of archaea of being, as simple as the verb in which this originary debate is uttered, einai, to be, to exist. To give a preliminary answer to this theoretical question, I'll quote a text by Nancy. This is a very short text that is perhaps not translated in English, to my knowledge, which was published, I think, in 2015 in the French review Désorganisation by Camille Fallin. our dear friend, and the text is called Ni foi ni savoir, which is followed by my Exister, Persister, which are kind of a dialogue organized by Camille. So I quote in my translation Jean-Luc's proposal: the absolute is nothing other than existence considered in itself. Existence by itself does not relate to anything. It is without dependence, without intention, without project or subject. It is to exist and to insist in that to exist. It is left to its own insistence or to the possibility of desist. It is exposed to trusting its own being or to distrust and turn away from it. Maybe I should at least read you the last sentences in French because they are quite crucial. Par elle-même, l'existence ne se rapporte à rien. Elle est sans dépendance, sans intention, sans projet ni sujet. Elle est d'exister et d'insister dans cet exister. Elle est livrée à sa propre insistance ou à la possibilité de s'en désister. Elle est exposée à se fier à son propre fait d'être ou à s'en défier et s'en détourner. End of quote. So, existence, in its irreducibility, in its universal singularity, existence is infinite. Existence is that which is both radically finite, radically discontinuous, and infinite, absolute. So, my hypothesis reads as follows. The radical interpretation of the concept of resurrection or insurrection in Noli Me Tangere is the paradigm of Nancy's thought of finitude, or, moreover, of his radical philosophy of existence. Here I would claim that Nancy's thought on resurrection and or insurrection, uprising, reveals the ultimate stakes of Nancy's philosophy, the new philosophy of existence. And here I need to say, because I had the pleasure to listen to the brilliant presentation of my dear friend Frédéric Neyrat, that it is not by chance, because Frédéric, as well as Jean-Luc Nancy, is and still is one of my closest fellow philosophers. Frédéric Neyrat didn't quote himself, but I need to quote him because he published this small book published by Lignes. This is Le communisme existentiel de Jean-Luc Nancy. And I think we do agree with Frédéric that what is at stake in Jean-Luc Nancy's philosophy is really a new philosophy of existence, a new philosophy of existence beyond what was called in 20th century existentialism. But that's, I will leave the historical dimension of the question maybe for the discussion later on. So the second phase of my talk relates, not without surprise, but also logically, to the next central phase of Jean-Luc Nancy's Noli Me Tangere, the undoubtedly heretic interpretation of the very scene of Noli Me Tangere. The insurrectional movement, the movement of raising up, reappears in Nancy's argument, but this time in order to be linked, no more and no less, to the presence of a woman, of a sinner, of Marie Magdalene. Thus, in the movement of the alteration, Christ's risen body becomes a body, having risen from the tomb, infinitely differing in its finitude from the body of Marie Magdalene. I quote the English translation of Noli Me Tangere. Noli Me Tangere is the world, Noli Me Tangere is the word and the instant of relation and of revelation between two bodies, that is, of a single body infinitely altered and exposed both in its fall, tombe, as well as in its raising, levé. Why then a body? Because only a body can be cut down or raised up. Because only a body can touch or not touch. A spirit can do nothing of the sort. A pure spirit gives only a formal and empty index of a presence entirely closed in oneself. A body opens this presence. It presents it. It puts presence outside of itself. It moves presence away from itself. And by that very fact, it brings others along with it. Marie Magdalene thus becomes the true body of the departed. End of quote. The story of Mary of Magdala reveals perhaps the most intimate secret, the one that Nancy's books gravitates around. And the secret is, at the end, the touch takes place. Touch touches the body. Touch touches. And the touch that touches, despite the ban, is the voice. It's the voice that forbids to touch, Noli tangere, and it is the voice in the gospel story, again, which touches. I remind you this famous scene where Mary of Magdala hears her own name, Mary, and she answers, Rabboni. And this is traditionally translated as master, but apparently it could be also read as my beloved one. So there is this ambiguity of the touch through voice. The voice that calls the woman by her name, the voice to which the woman answers, touches. The voice touches the voice. Voices echo one to another, one to the other. They resonate together. This touch, this intertwining, this haunting or habitation of the voices is called, or could be called, music. The music, the voices that touch to become a body, the unimaginable singularity, a new body, tangible and intangible at the same time. Hence, it is through desire that body exceeds itself, up to the point in which it touches to the untouchable, to convert it into touch. I quote a very short enigmatic sentence from the lecture De l'âme on the soul, which is added to Corpus, second edition of Corpus, which is the following. L'intouchable, c'est que ça touche. The untouchable is that it touches. End of quote. There is no doubt that we have here a heretical statement. Heretical in the stronger etymological sense of the word. It is the result of a hieresis, of a choice or decision. I have no doubt that the question of desire remains the secret core of Jean-Luc Nancy's philosophy. I have no doubt that the question of desire should be the first question not only of a new theory of the subject, but also of a new philosophy of existence. It is in this perspective, by the way, that I once ventured into proposing the term of erosophy, echoing proposals of Jean-Luc Nancy himself from La Pensée dérobée, and not by accident, this happened again in Strasbourg in discussion with Jean-Luc Nancy some years ago. In a conversation that we published in 2009 called The Metamorphoses, the World, we discussed with Nancy. I'll show you this publication. I think it's not translated in French either. This is in the Revue Rue Descartes, 2009. We discussed the question of, or the concept of a desire of the world, the desire of the world, as an ontological or rather ontogonic power, the very power of existence. I quote Nancy's answer to my question. If you ask, what does the world want from us? I think I would answer, it wants to be in us, like us, through us and all our worlds. But it wants to is then neither subjective nor intentional. In other words, ça pousse, it grows. The pousser, the push, is pushing. La poussée pousse. That is, it simply pushes. It exerts the pressure, the tension, which causes a gap, and by this gap, a link. End of quote. Isn't this pousser, synonymous of the Latin surgo, of the Latin rising, from which also comes the word of fountain? Thus, according to Nancy, the push is pushing, the surge is insurging. Now, it is this reflexive moment of the la poussée se pousse, la poussée pousse, this very reflexivity of the pulsion, of the impulse, or of the drive, or of the surge, which appears as a driving cause, the cause of transformation, paradoxical, immanent, efficient cause. Desire, the drive, the push, the emergence or the resurgence of the world, therefore, comes here as another name of the intensive extension of the modes of the world, of the movement of its immanent metamorphosis. This insurrectional force, flexion or reflection, this reflexive moment of the insurrection, transcends what is, that is, what is more than what is. In this sense, the resurrection builds upon the scheme of immanent excess. The immanence of resurrection is insurrection, rising up in its immanent power. It is its immanent power. What we need today, what philosophy needs today, is to radicalize Nancy's radical deconstruction of Christianity in the perspective of a radical existential philosophy. A radical existential philosophy is the one that experiences excess as immanent to existence. That is, excess is not surplus of being, but is its very schema. Such is the insurrectional power of existence. Thus, henceforth, anastasis is a figure of the uprising, which is also a figure of metamorphosis, that is, of becoming not just another, but of rising up, raising up as other. I quote again Noli me tangere. The difference, though, a slight difference, difficult to discern, has to do with what anastasis is not or does not bring about from the self, from the subject proper, but from the other. Anastasis comes to the self from the other or arises from the other within the self. Or again, it is the raising of the other in the self. It is the other that rises and resurrects, in French, qui se lève et qui ressuscite within the dead self. End of quote. Anastasis, insurrection, is the immanent movement of auto-transcendence, an immanent, paradoxical allo-transcendence. The other who is in the self, the being that is more than I in me, the immanent excess of existence, raises up in the subject or in the body. This reflexive movement of alteration, this flexion is, by the way, a concept that Jean-Luc Nancy develops in his later text, is much closer to Deleuze's folding, pli, than to the ontotheological scheme of return or restitution of the necessary being of ultimate existence. It is not the repetition of substantivite or hypostatic being, but the process of immanent differentiation of existence. Thus, the conceptual figures of the existence, of the concept of existence in Nancy are always dynamic. In the first place, the vertical movement of autotranscendence, resurrection or insurrection, and then the horizontal movement of the proliferating metamorphosis, of the plasticity of becoming other of body, the movement called desire. Desire as the principium individuationis of modal ontology. Thus, modal ontology is a term that I developed in the last 2 decades, building upon one phrase from corpus of Nancy, but that's another story. So the modal ontology, conceived according to the idea of creation as metamorphosis, necessarily leads to the rejection of messianic or salutary logic. In attempting to go beyond the obvious, one could ask a more complex, somewhat heretical question as well, notably whether the emphasis placed on anastasis, the resurrection or raising up, is not charged with the task of opposing messianic thinking. If the Messiah has passed once and for all, then what would be to come is the infinity present of the raising up, the rebirth, resurrection, the infinite coming of presence or to presence, the birth to presence. Thus, paradoxically, for Nancy anastasis, the resurrection or insurrection is conceived not as a return to the regime of the eternity of being, but always as the infinite modelization of the world. The infinity of the raising up is therefore the infinity of finitude. The deconstruction of Christianity, to come to its appointed end, should be the affirmation of radical finitude. While it shows first that the infinity opens up alongside finitude in the infinity of the raising up, this infinity is subsequently affirmed as the infinity of finitude itself. The project of deconstructing Christianity is therefore entirely governed by the requirement of an infinitely finite thinking. These are the anarchic archae, the anarchic principles of Nancy's philosophy of existence. And an epilogue. The resurrection, the raising up of the body. We may venture calling this raising up, this auto-transcendence, which is the proper movement of existence, thought. Thought is that raising up. Thought is insurrection. The insurrection of thought. By this insurrectionary, singular and absolute power, existence insists, it persists. That is also why today, here, at this very moment, Jean-Luc is with us, rising up with his thought in its infinite insurrection. He is with us today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Do we have any questions, Georgios? Georgios, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Thank you so much. So rich, so many things. And I hear a lot of resonances also with Paul's talk. The kind of sleeping, the relation of sleep and death, the kind of positions also of sleep and death. I actually wonder whether there were burial practices at the time of Christ, and also in the case of Lazarus, where, as is depicted in many icons, the dead would almost be vertical. But that is something that is kind of worth, from a historical or iconological perspective, perhaps thinking. But more perhaps even interestingly and perplexingly, the word stasis has, of course, one meaning, which is to stand. But as Artemi, who I believe has left, it means also a civil war in classical language, but also it means rest, right? It's one of the 5 highest kinds in Plato. The other being a kinesis, which interestingly is another word for war, another word for war. So, for example, Thucydides calls the civil war in between Peloponnesus and Athens, the greatest kinesis, the greatest movement. So it's what I'm trying to so anastasis potentially is also a coming again of a rest, and you're in a very strange way in your closure, this kind of insistence or persistence, the stance in those words kind of has this kind of reposing, perhaps. What I'm getting at is whether in this anastasis there is perhaps something also reposing, a coming to rest again, perhaps. I find the complexity of those words, which kind of seem to go both ways in many cases, very interesting.
Thank you very much for this comment and question, Georgis. I'm not sure if I have to answer right away, but I'm just taking the opportunity because, in fact, I think that I mean it's a quite of a task to try to map out the, let's say, the conceptual variations of Nancy's thought, right? Because I think Nancy is definitely not a systematic thinker, but as in one of the previous participation, there was a quote from Friedrich Schlegel. I think he could very well subscribe, and he did it in L'Absolu Littéraire, of course, to the romantic idea of fragment. And very often Nancy, I think, is creating this kind of, I would call it intensive dialectics of concepts, which is not leading to sublation or not to relève, but to sort of a lever, to like a lifting or raising up, which creates new intensities. And why I'm saying this, because I think that indeed, very often he kind of oscillates between conceptual possibilities in his work. And anastasis, my reading of anastasis in relation to the questions of finitude and existence, but also kind of a feature of his kind of what I call insurrectional thought, which nowadays has this kind of a little ambiguous connotations, but I completely decided to erase this, so I'm not talking of anything like, you know, White House, etc. So, right, it's obvious that I'm speaking of something completely else. And there is, I think, because you spoke of rest, and I think someone said in the morning that Jean-Luc had this kind of serenity, and I think there is also a sort of a restlessness in his philosophy. There is something that is la pousse, and that there was this kind of intensity also of production of concepts, although he doesn't really subscribe to Deleuze's idea of invention of concepts and kind of remained kind of skeptical to Deleuze, right? But in a way, there is also this kind of on the one hand, insurrectional power, and on the other hand, you're absolutely right that he's also in other texts as if he's taking this other dimension of stasis, because I'm thinking of a not very well known text, and I guess it's not translated in English, the Tombe du Sommeil, how this is called in English, like
Fall of Sleep. Yeah, it's been translated.
It's been translated. Sorry, I didn't follow it. So fall asleep, right? So here there are these kind of very interesting reflection around the notion of precisely of tomber, which is the opposite of lever, of profondeur, of gravitas, if you wish. So I think that this kind of tension between pose, supposé, right, which gives position, and which is also close to what I'm calling persistence, right? So it is both to exist, but also to insist in certain place, in certain position. And I think this is also something very peculiar for Jean-Luc Nancy, that he really was insistent in his position, although the conceptual variation in this are proliferating very often and very powerful. But for me, because I just took the opportunity to reread, I've published maybe around 10 texts around this small book since Jean-Luc sent it to me 20 years ago. And this was an occasion to rethink from this other perspective, that la levée du cœur means something else as well, and that there is no resurrection any longer, right? So, and this thought on finitude, I think, has a really peculiar dimension in Nancy, which is the thought of radical finitude, which is going, as Frédéric says, again against the après finitude, the post, finitude kind of line of thought, but also again, let's say, Alain Badiou's emphasis on the concept of eternity, which according to him remains one of the main concepts of philosophy. And so I think that between this eternity of Badiou's being and the infinity of Nancy's idea of existence, there is a really interesting polemic. So that's I think the really philosophical stake here. So thank you very much for your comment.
And I think Asa, you have the next question.
Well, yeah, thank you, Boyan. I really enjoyed your development. If we ask when it's time for body to in search, when it's time for body to rise, we end up to conclude that any time. So it means that the body in the Nancian sense, the Nancian body is born as something excessive, insurrectional, revolting, or resurrected. Do you agree?
In potentia, I would say yes.
Mm. It's a very interesting. It's a very interesting birth, as a matter of fact, if we think about it. You said that body is both tangible and intangible, and it relates to this question of touch, which a little bit disturbs me in the Nancian concepts, given that it is given so much importance, because nevertheless the touch is conditioned by the corporality. As you said, that only body can be raised, only body can touch and be touched. So this tactic orientation, in a way, like phenomenologizes sometimes Nancian thinking, given that I think the corporality has a sort of primacy. Or do you agree?
I think I absolutely agree, Asa, and great to see you and to listen to you after so long.
Yeah.
First of all,
right.
But I think there is something that for many years I was, as a reader of Jean-Luc Nancy, and also as someone who not necessarily agrees on everything with him, I was trying to emphasize there is something that I definitely agree with Nancy, and that is his skepticism toward the concept of event. And he's very explicit about it, of this kind of messianic line, which I think is quite present in 20th century philosophy, and especially in the last decades. I don't want to quote names, but you all understand who I'm talking about. And I think precisely that this, what I call insurrectional power, that is immanent to existence, is precisely what he opposes to this idea of big kind of rupture of event of a big interruption, which imposes another regime, if you wish, of being or of existence. And here, I think he sees this kind of a latent or potential power of every instant to grow this kind of insurrectional power. This doesn't mean that every instant would actualize it. And there is this connection, a very interesting connection to Aristotle, and I think it was a very rich presentation of Paul's that I followed really with a big pleasure. There is a very interesting idea of potentiality in Nancy, which I think is very different than this kind of somewhat doxic rereading in the last decades of Spinoza's thought and also of Aristotelian tradition, which to some extent would remind me, I would say, even medieval radical Aristotelians, the ones that Ernst Bloch calls the Aristotelian left. I think of philosophers like Ibn Sina or Avicenna, we call him Latin spelling. So they're very this kind of I think levels of potentiality, of levels of actualization, which make this kind of idea of existence in Nancy as something really complex and not, so to say, bidimensional, which is, there is this kind of a front line between potentiality and actuality, which is kind of a curve, which in a way reminds me of Deleuzian thought, although developed in a very different way. And I think that is what matters for Nancy, is precisely this. I'm calling it front. I think he would call it skin, like in corpus. But since you were skeptical about this issue of tactility, but I think skin for him is also sort of an ontological surface. Or maybe Frederick would be skeptical about ontology, then let's say surface of the world, where things are rising, right? And it's again close, but not identical to Deleuzian thought. So that's a little bit of an attempt to map out the position of Nancy in contemporary thought and what I think is really crucial at stake with this philosophy.
Great. Thank you, Boyan.
Thank you, Hassan.
And Frederick, if you have a question.
Hi, dear Boyan. Thank you for your talk. I missed the beginning because I was trying to find a negative test to fly back to the US. But I was very interested in the passage of your talk when you were speaking about the relation between existence and la poussée, the drive, the pulsion, and so on. And so I was imagining a title for an article or a book, or we can maybe write it together. I was imagining a title like la pulsion d'existence, or the existential drive, or like the drive for existence. I don't know. And I was imagining maybe this article already exists. Maybe Jean-Luc Nancy has already written something like that, or maybe you have to write it. But really, my question is about the relation between drive and existence. Would you say something like, my question is about the relation between the drive and the instinct and the X. Would you say that the X in the word existence is the place for the drive? That is to say, to be outside, to existere, we are outside because there is something that pushed us outside, right? So you see what I mean? The relation, is the X a place for the drive? And is the skin, because you insisted on that, would you say that the skin is the surface by which we are exposed to the outside? You know, I don't know if I can be more precise, maybe not. So X and the drive, my question.
I think it's behind my back, corpus. You remember this concept of corpus, exposition, P-E-A-U? I think exposition would be a very good translation of existence in that way. Frédéric, I didn't know you missed the beginning of my talk, but I was quoting Frédéric Neyrat and saying that we are obviously allies in our drive to existence. And for many years, we tried to write a book together and we never ended up. So maybe it's time, but we have exchanged a lot. That's what I said, that together with Nancy, I think you were my closest, one of the closest French companions of thought, and very inspirational for me. So you did this work on existence, and today even you said you made this connection between decision and existence, which for me, for my philosophical kind of work, is absolutely crucial. And I think Nancy is trying to imply this issue of, maybe decision is too strong word, but this kind of what I call hairesis, right? The choice of existence, that the existence could decide to be in existence or to desist. So that this is, I mean, this is also very complex and could be a very ambivalent thinking as well, but I don't think we have really time to go in depth. But just to say something, because you said ek, the ek, right? The particle, and of course, ecstasis, which is the analog of existere, is directly connected to anastasis, right? Another, so to stepping out, right? To stepping out. So this sistere is definitely connected to the same root as stasis and the verb histemi. Even I think they come from the same root. So there is this kind of a definite connection. And as much as you, before even being inspired by Jean-Luc Nancy, I've been very inspired by the work of Georges Bataille. That's why I always emphasize this kind of, let's say, Bataillean side of Nancy, this kind of excessive idea of existence and desire that, by the way, already in her beautiful talk, Alke evoked in the morning, the power of eros, the power of love. And there is this, I think, seminal book of Nancy, La Pensée dérobée, which is starting from Bataille. And I think this is precisely this idea of la pulsion, the impulse, the push or the drive to existence. So I definitely think that I would agree with Essa that this idea that with birth already we have this insurrectional power in potentia, because what is existence? I mean, to me, a definition of existence would be it is more than what it is. So it is always ecstatic in its very definition. And that's why it is not this kind of a being with capital B. But let's not return to history of ontology and this kind of a substantivation of the verb einai, which is, I think, at stake here. And I think that Nancy was always on the side of this kind of a dynamic. I wouldn't call it ontology, because I'm also, as much as you, skeptical to this term, but let's say ontogony, this making of the world. So he was, I think, never on the side of the, even, I dare saying, Heideggerian kind of a reawakening of being. I think, to me, Nancy remains closer to Bataille than to Heidegger in that respect.
Thank you, excellent. Thank you, Boyan.
And then Augia, I think, with the last question.
Yeah, I think we are exceeding the time a little bit, but we somehow agreed to expand until 7 o'clock, I think. Yeah, so let me try to phrase a question, because I have some new ones related to the discussion we just had. And I think you kind of answered already a little bit in answering to Asa's question. But I'm now curious about the role of salvation in relation to your talk. So I think I do agree with your observation that Nancy is, in some sense, in an important sense, opposed to messianistic thinking in his affirmation of this radical finitude. But this, of course, also changes the view on the role of salvation. And he's not very fond of the whole idea of salvation and being saved, etc. On the other hand, one of the associations or even significations or meanings of resurrection is also, in a sense, in the medical sense, sauver la vie. So resuscitate is really to reanimate a body that is on the verge of dying, or in fact really dying, and to bring it back to life as a medical act of saving this life. So what does your interpretation of Nancy, to which I completely agree, does it lead us to another thinking of salvation, do you think?
This is a very difficult question, okay, and I can even answer in a very personal fashion, because if Jean-Luc was here today with us, I would be very radically critical to this idea of salvation, as he was in his lifetime. But, it's now we have the task to think how salvation would be possible without salvation, like a little bit Derrida's messianism without messianity or whatever. So I think, and there is this ambiguity of the term salut, right, which is salve, which is related to health. And of course, in Noli Me Tangere, as much as in Corpus, after, in a way, resurrecting after his heart transplant, Nancy was extremely critical to the religious notion of salvation. Precisely because I think he was on the side of radical finitude. And however, he was on that side as already resurrected in a way, as you say, sauvé. So this is a really, really difficult question. But what is certain is that I think we would all agree that there is a radical critique on precisely this kind of a messianic salvatory, if I may call it that way, line in Nancy's thought. We all know that he was brought up as not only as a believer, but as a practicing Christian. And in a way, I think he is also insurgent Christian. I think there is, I remember his debate with Derrida on the last decade of Derrida, 2002 and at Cerisy, where definitely he was precisely, how should I say, more radically critical to this messianic tradition of salvation than Derrida, who was obviously not at all inscribed in that tradition, but tempted in a way by it. So I think there is this kind of a attempt. I think the construction of Christianity is the attempt to, on one hand, to show this kind of movement of auto-deconstruction. I don't know how to say this in English. Auto-deconstruction. He spoke about it within the very, if you wish, structure of Christianity. And on the other hand, of course, this is an attempt to radically step beyond, but still operating with its own figures and concepts because they were part of his own background. I mean, for me, I'm completely, sorry to say this, joyful pagan. I've never been even baptized. I'm maybe not supposed to say that. So I don't have this problem, but you understand me. So I think there is this kind of insurrection within the horizon of Christian thought in Jean-Luc Nancy. I think he's very explicit about it. And of course, I would like to have some radically secular thought on salvation as well.
Thank you.
And this is the final question from Slavko.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Boyan. Nice to see you after some time. Maybe not that much a question, but maybe I would like to hear your thoughts and on opinion on, since you mentioned already exposition, which I think is in a way a crucial concept for Nancy's work, although he mentions it only in Corpus, the book, but I think it brings together his materialist post-deconstruction or his relation to materialism and ontology. So, and to further complicate your dilemmas about and problematization of ontology in general in relation to Nancy, I would like to propose, and I would hear your thoughts on considering aesthesis as the first philosophy instead of ontology, or ontology as up to the very bottom aesthetic, which I think Nancy gives good grounds for interpreting it that way in sense of the world, but also in muses when he speaks, but in particular in sense of the world when he speaks about aesthesis, not in the Kantian aesthetic tradition, but in the originary meaning of aesthesis, and especially in relation to exposition as a materialist exposing existence. So I would like just to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Slavko. It was a great pleasure to see you tonight. after so long, in fact. But this is a great question, very, I would say, difficult one. And perhaps I should start precisely with this short conference, eponymous conference, de l'âme, which repeats peripsyches, because obviously his intention is, he's in fact debating with Descartes, but he's in a way returning to Aristotle. And that's why I think there is implicit continuity between Paul and my lectures tonight, although I didn't have time to develop this dimension at all. But for instance, in my book, L'altération du monde, I was taking precisely the Aristotelian concept of aloiosis, because Aristotle says that each aesthesis is aloiosis. It's something becoming something else. So from that point of view, it's absolutely crucial for our question. And the connection to Aristotle for me is fundamental. I tried to build a term many years ago, onto-aesthetic, in order to replace ontology. But now I'm a little bit, because it's too heavy, onto-aesthetic. Why do we need that? I mean, it's obviously speaking of the world through the experience as such, which is aesthetic experience, which is the meaning of aesthesis, besides logos, but perhaps logos as aesthesis as well. So from that point of view, and also knowing your work, I think this is absolutely crucial for not only the ontological dimension of Nancy's thought, but also of his political thought. So I think it's a very important in his thought of community, and I can imagine tomorrow there will be very interesting proposals around that. The community of bodies as well, you know. So that's, but what is the question of aesthesis is crucial in relation to the question of singularity, because there was a lot of discussion around Nancy's notion of community, but of course this is a very complex issue, because I think what is at stake with this notion is, first of all, the notion of singularity. And in his small book, La démocratie à venir, the democracy to come, he was very explicit about this concept of singularity, of what he was called in relation to the concept of justice, the concept of equality, as opposed to what he was calling the discourse of equivalence, which would be the discourse of late capitalism. And I think from that point of view, this kind of the way to confront singularity is always aesthetic. So I think that's something where this ontological dimension, political dimension of Nancy meet, although he was, as we all know, very skeptical about the onto-political kind of a juxtaposition, right? So I think that's absolutely crucial in both ontological and political sense, but I think that's such a complex issue that we will need to spend the night until the second day of our symposium. Thank you very much, Slavcho. Great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Boyan. And yes, you're definitely right. It is tightly related to the question of the political. I've been trying to think through the concept of bodying in common, deriving it from being in common, but that's another question. So thank you. Thank you.